Liberalism, section Wage Labor and the Categories of Slavery. Some decades after Franklin, in transition from the first to the second great controversy in the Liberal Party, the governor of South Carolina, James Henry Hammond, likewise applied himself to emphasizing how much quasi-slavery persisted in Britain. He sent an open letter to Thomas Clarkson, the venerable patriarch of English abolitionism, putting his finger on the sore point of the workers' condition in the country that boasted of having abolished slavery in its colonies. Beginning of long quote. When you look around you, how dare you talk to us before the world of slavery? If you are really humane, philanthropic, and charitable, here are objects for you. Relieve them, emancipate them, raise them from the condition of brutes to the level of human beings, of American slaves at least. End quote. Obviously, reactions in Britain were indignant, insisting on the characteristic feature of the free man that applied to even the most wretched wage laborer. However, in defining him, the liberal tradition frequently had recourse to the same categories as were used in classical antiquity and across the Atlantic in relation to the black slave. In Locke's view, not genuinely capable of intellectual and moral life was, quote, the greatest part of mankind who are given up to labor and enslaved to the necessity of their mean condition, whose lives are worn out only in the provisions for living, wholly absorbed in stilling the croaking of their own bellies or the cries of their children, end quote. Such people had no possibility of thinking about other things. Quote, 'Tis not to be expected that a man who drudges on all his life in a laborious trade should be more knowing in the variety of things done in the world than a pack horse, who is driven constantly forwards and backwards in a narrow lane and dirty road only to market, should be skilled in the geography of a country. End quote. Locke had no hesitation in asserting that, quote, there is a greater distance between some men and others, in this respect, than between some men and some beasts. End quote. To appreciate this, it was enough to contrast Westminster Hall and the Exchange with almshouses and Bedlam. The boundary separating the human world from the animal world was imperceptible and evanescent. Quote, if we compare the understanding and abilities of some men and some brutes, we shall find so little difference that 'twill be hard to say that that of the man is either clearer or larger. End quote. Similarly, Mandeville, condemning the spread of education to popular strata, compared the wage laborer to a horse. Quote, no creatures submit contentedly to their equals, and should a horse know as much as a man, I should not desire to be his rider. End quote. This was a metaphor that reappeared on the occasion of his polemic against the excessive generosity displayed by the rich master to the servant in England. Quote, a man may have 25 horses in his stables without being guilty of folly, if it suits with the rest of his circumstances. But if he keeps but one, and overfeeds it to shew his wealth, he is a fool for his pains. End quote. It was not only English liberalism that argued in these terms. In fact, the process of dehumanization possibly reached its peak in Sieyès. Beginning of long quote. The unfortunates devoted to arduous work, producers of other people's enjoyments, who receive scarcely enough to sustain their suffering, needy bodies. This enormous crowd of bipedal tools, without liberty, without morality, without intellectual faculties, equipped solely with hands that earn little, and a mind burdened with 1,000 worries that serves them only to suffer. Are these what you call men? They are deemed civilized, Polly says, but have we seen a single one of them who is capable of entering into society? End quote. On other occasions, the process of dehumanization occurred in a different fashion. Adopting the distinction peculiar to classical antiquity between the various instruments of labor. Burke subsumed the wage laborer under the category of instrumentum vocale. Similarly, Saez referred to the, quote, majority of men defined, above all, in private notes predating 1789 as work machines, machine de travail, instruments of labor, instrument de labeur, human instruments of production, instrument humain de la production, or bipedal tools, instrument bipedes. Traces of this process of dehumanization can even be found in Smith. By dint of the duress and monotony of his work, a wage laborer, quote, generally becomes as stupid and ignorant as it is possible for a human creature to become. Incapable of participating, quote, in any rational conversation, or conceiving any generous sentiment. End quote. As across the Atlantic with black slaves and slaves in general, so in Europe the dominant class was separated from white servants by a gulf that had ethnic and racial connotations. In Locke's view, quote, a day laborer is no more capable of reasoning than almost a perfect natural, i.e. an ignorant aborigine. End quote. Neither had yet reached the level of, quote, rational creatures and Christians. End quote. In his turn, Saez was of the opinion that the, quote, human instruments of production pertained to a people different from and inferior to that comprising the heads of production, or intelligent persons, or respectable folk. A further reason intervened to render the gulf separating the community of the free from servants and slaves unbridgeable. The latter were considered incapable of fully appreciating the humiliations, the frustrations, the sufferings, the pain, as well as all the other feelings characteristic of man's spiritual existence. We have seen how Mandeville argued in relation to the mass of wretches in Europe. They were forced to suffer hardship and privations, and often ended up on the gallows for trifles, which they made themselves guilty of in an attempt to escape hunger. However, beginning a long quote, to be happy is to be pleased, and the less notion a man has of a better way of living, the more content he'll be with his own. When a man enjoys himself, laughs and sings, and in his gesture and behavior shows me all the tokens of content and satisfaction, I pronounce him happy. End quote. On careful examination, the greatest king could envy the peace of mind of the meanest and most uncivilized peasant, and his tranquility of soul. In no less emphatic terms, the Virginian theorist we have already encountered, Thomas Ardew, expressed himself on the subject of slaves. Quote, we have no doubts that they form the happiest portion of our society. A merrier being does not exist on the face of the globe than the Negro slave of the United States. End quote. Not only is it very difficult to define the condition of white servants in Europe as free, but the image of them transmitted by the liberal thought of the time is not much different from the image of the black slave in the southern United States. So was the governor of South Carolina right to mock the abolitionists' hypocrisy and credulity? That would be a hasty conclusion. In any event, we are obliged to reflect further on the characteristics of the society that was being formed on either side of the Atlantic, and on the categories best suited to understanding it. End section.